Hey everybody, Peter Maravellis here. I hope this finds you all safe and well. I'd like to welcome you to City Lights Live, the virtual reading series that follows in the footsteps of our in-store calendar during the time of the pandemic. We are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral grounds of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, from where we continue to celebrate the works of authors we know and love with readings, discussions, and forums, moving into the fall season and hopefully towards a COVID-free era. Tonight, we are thrilled to have the Auntie Sewing Squad in the house, celebrating this fantastic new book. Auntie Sewing Squad are this amazing mutual aid network made up of volunteers who actually designed and sewed face masks for the people who needed them on the front lines in the wake of the COVID pandemic. They were outraged by the US government's failure to rise to the occasion, and they came together in a grassroots fashion to do something about it. They have produced thousands and thousands of masks. Their work has saved lives, and it has brought together a beautiful community of activists in a very mirthful and lighthearted manner to provide some hope during the darkest hours of the pandemic. So we are celebrating tonight a new book published by the University of California Press. It is called The Auntie Sewing Squad Guide to Mask Making, Radical Care, and Racial Justice. It tells their story in a wonderful combination of text, graphics, recipes, photographs, and absolutely delightful and heartwarming accounts. So with us tonight are the authors of this wonderful new book. They are the Auntie Sewing Squad members, Mai-Linh, Chrissy Lau, and Preeti Sharma. And they will be joined by none other than Rebecca Solnit. Rebecca is no stranger to City Lights, having graced our halls on numerous occasions. She is a writer, historian, activist, and author of more than 20 books on feminism, Western Indigenous history, popular power, social change, and much more. Very, very important to note for the sake of tonight's event that Auntie Valerie So recruited Ms. Solnit in April of 2020, and she became a non-sewing member of the Auntie Sewing Squad, who the founding member of the group, Kristina Wong, dubbed Rebecca as the quote unquote writer, historian, shakedown auntie for the other roles that she has actually played in the group. So join us now in giving a warm welcome to our guests. I turn it over also to Rebecca Solnit to get the evening started. Everybody, welcome to City Lights Live.
So lovely to see all the aunties and uncles and other members of the squad here. So lovely to see all of you here. And I'm here to moderate a little bit, throw out some questions, and introduce the three co-editors of this completely amazing book that looks kind of small when you pick it up, but has so much on the inside. It's packed with photographs, drawings, mask patterns, and interviews, essays, just an extraordinary amount of stuff that begins to give a little bit of a portrait of the incredible dynamism, complexity, and fabulousness of the Auntie Sewing Squad. So I'm going to introduce the three editors. Mai-Linh is Assistant Professor of Literature, Languages, and Cultures at UC Merced, specializing in Asian American Studies, Race, Refugees, and Justice. Her essays, articles, and poetry have appeared in numerous journals and edited volumes, including Amerasia Mielis, which I'm probably pronouncing wrong, Verge, Studies in Global Asias, and the Virginia Journal of International Law. She's co-founder of Asylum for the Arts, a community-engaged research initiative that aims to support refugee and immigrant writers and artists connected to the Central Valley. From 2017 to 2021, Maelyn co-chaired the Circle for Asian American Literary Studies. As a sewing auntie, she has made 4,000 masks for donation. Chrissy Lau is Assistant Professor of History at Cal State University, Monterey Bay. Her research and teaching interests include Asian American history, women's history, and public history. She has published her research in the anthology Gendering the Trans-Pacific World and a special issue of Southern California Quarterly on Asian American public history. She's also researched and developed exhibitions at the National Museum of American History and the Chinese American Museum in LA. She's the director of the Auntie Sewing Squad Oral History Archive, which is completely amazing, incidentally. Her forthcoming manuscript, New Women of Empire is a history of how young Japanese American women negotiated the US and Japanese imperial ideologies around modern womanhood. Preeti Sharma is Assistant Professor of American Studies at Cal State Long Beach. Her scholarship on feminist theories of work, racial capitalism, service economies, and alternative labor organizing have appeared in the Journal of Asian American Studies, the Labor Studies Journal, and Society and Space. She's also published Nail Files, the first national policy study on labor issues in the nail salon sector, a report she co-authored for the UCLA Labor Center. Her book project, The Thread Between Them, examines the transnational beauty practice of threading through labor regulation and contestation in beauty salons across LA County and the neoliberal immigrant service sector. So welcome, aunties, scholar aunties, it's academic aunties. So there's like so many places to start, but I thought I'd start with how each of you found out about the Auntie Sewing Squad and came to join it and what you did once you were in it. So take it away. Somebody go first. Chrissy, you look ready.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for attending our event, and thank you to City Lights for hosting this wonderful book launch. So my name is Chrissy Lau, and I first heard about the Auntie Sewing Squad through the performance artist Kristina Wong, who declares herself as the sweatshirt overlord and the founder of the Auntie Sewing Squad. I first heard about Kristina Wong when I was a graduate student at UC Santa Barbara. I became a fan of her performance artwork. She focused performance on mental health and Asian American women. And ever since then, I became a fan of her work, and I took her environmental justice theater workshop, and I followed her on social media. So once COVID-19 hit the US shores, I saw that she started sewing masks. So I wanted to also learn how to sew masks. So I started actually watching YouTube tutorials and making my own masks. And I saw that she soon needed help, and she was creating this collective to meet the mask requests that she was getting from a lot of different hospitals and people, communities, friends. So I joined, and I initially joined because I wanted to learn how to make masks and actually get access to materials that at that time was really hard to come by. It was hard to come by elastic. It was hard to come by 100% cotton. And the Auntie Sewing Squad actually had those resources. And I would say that I was a lurker at first. I watched, I observed, and I was checking out the group, and they were probably checking me out. And I would say that I became a very active member, a sewing auntie, right around April of 2020, when it was clear that the Auntie Sewing Squad pivoted to prioritizing BIPOC communities, Black, Indigenous, people of color communities, and saw that there was a real need to send out masks to those communities because they were underserved and they were disenfranchised because of historical structural racism. So as a historian who studies Asian American womanhood, community organizing, solidarity is the main core of how we can collectively organize against systematic injustice. So once I saw the Auntie Sewing Squad create this huge campaign of 5,000 masks sent to the Navajo Nation, I decided that's it. I'm gonna pledge 25 masks, and I'm gonna purchase a sewing machine, and I'm gonna learn how to use the sewing machine watching YouTube videos, and I'm gonna get materials from the Material Hub, and I'm gonna make masks for other folks and express solidarity to the Navajo Nation. And so that's when I became a full-fledged sewing auntie.
I can sort of piggyback off of that, if that makes sense. So thank you again, City Lights, for having us. and for being the space for us to launch this wonderful project, which, you know, involves some of us here, but 50 aunties in the book itself, and over 800 aunties in the Auntie Sewing Squad itself. So such an expansive mutual aid project that I still, you know, I feel like I don't know how many of us have had the space or time to process the pandemic that we're still very much in, but when I do get to take some sort of sense of stock, particularly in this book project and writing this book, I'm constantly in awe that the Auntie Sewing Squad formed, existed, happened, and is still sort of meeting online. But I, like Chrissy, will start off by saying that I joined the Auntie Sewing Squad by being an admirer of Kristina Wong's and a Facebook friend of Kristina Wong's. And for those who don't know, the Auntie Sewing Squad has an extensive working group on Facebook. So I had just ironically sort of vowed to not be on Facebook and not be online. And then the pandemic hits the US, as Chrissy said. And it's the place that we're connecting with each other and sort of coming together. And I think, like Chrissy, I had met Kristina Wong as a sort of nerd undergrad at the University of Florida, where I was interested in Asian American studies. And then I re-met her at UCLA, similarly interested in Asian American studies. And I saw this post that, you know, Kristina was sort of asking for people in Los Angeles, which is where I'm based, to fill in any role for sewing or cutting. And I think, like others in the group and folks in general, I felt pretty restless in the pandemic. I mean, it's still going on. I still feel restless. But, you know, there's a lot of sort of uncertainty, and I kind of had this inclination to not just help, but want to kind of make sense of the pandemic through, I guess, action and language. And, you know, I was also really interested in kind of, I don't even know if it was really formed, right? But the immediacy of the kind of need, and a space where that understanding of that need is rooted in justice. But honestly, you know, I just saw the post and I was sort of thinking, I don't know how to sew, but this cutting thing seems interesting. So let me start there. And I had just mentioned it on a post, and it was rapid fire. I think Kristina messaged me right away. Next thing you know, I am getting a tub of fabric from Amy Toff down the street. And this is the time where, like, we're wearing gloves, and I didn't have them. I don't know what kind of mask I had at that point. So we're distanced outdoors, getting this carton full of fabric that I don't even know what I'm supposed to do with. And I got on a video call with Auntie Ellen Gavin, who's a part of the West Side configuration of the Auntie Sewing Squad. And we can talk all about this. I feel like I'm into a little bit of auntie speak right now, but Ellen gets on the phone with me through video chat, and I'm going to spare you the details about how we didn't know how to use each other's video platforms, but she looks at my scissors and she says, "What are you doing? You can't cut fabric with regular scissors." And that's when I realized I had to get fabric scissors. So I really am just letting everyone know I didn't know how to do anything related to fabric or sewing. And so that is my short and long answer to your question.
Hi, everybody. I'm Maelyn Hong. It's really wonderful to see all of these aunties and all of these friends and colleagues. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much to City Lights. So I think of the three of us, I was the last to join, so probably in late April or so of 2020. But I had started sewing masks pretty early in March, when it became clear that masks were going to be needed, even if the CDC hadn't admitted that yet. And I was living at the time in a small town in Pennsylvania. I've since relocated to California, but at the time I was in a pretty red town, and it was already sort of becoming evident that there were pandemic things that were going to be politicized, but the small town environment kind of made me feel that I could sort of make a difference. So just on my own, before knowing about the Auntie Sewing Squad, I started sewing masks and giving them away from a box on my porch. And it was very rudimentary at the time. In fact, I wrote a sign. It was in a shoebox. I made a sign, and somebody later commented, "Oh, your son must have helped you with the sign." My son was 3. I was like, "No, I wrote that sign." I mean, it really was very, very like, we were just trying to get masks out to the community. And there was such a demand that I was making more and more masks and just refilling the box several times a day. But it was such a stressful, and everybody was anxious. It was a very stressful time. But it was wonderful to start connecting with friends who were also sewing, including Chrissy Lau, my colleague who I had known from previous projects and so forth. And she invited me to join the Auntie Sewing Squad. And at the time I had joined some local Facebook groups to sew face masks, but the politics within those groups were a little, I didn't totally feel at home in some of those spaces. And so once I joined the Auntie Sewing Squad, I could see right away how different it was. So first of all, just that some of these other predominantly white sewing groups were mostly older white women who were sewing in a kind of Rosie the Riveter tradition, which was wonderful in some respects, but then there was a kind of streak of like patriotic duty that was going through. Whereas, we were in the Trump era, and it was very clear that there were all kinds of racial inequities that were coming into play. And so I wasn't always totally comfortable in those spaces. But the Auntie Sewing Squad was clearly led by women of color. The progressive politics were first and foremost in the group. There was no shying away from that, because it was clear from pretty early on that communities of color were going to be completely, could be completely devastated by the accumulation of racial inequities and then the way the pandemic was playing out. So I continued to sew. I got faster and faster at it. It became harder and harder to work in the job that I was paid for, because for research and writing and so forth, because I lost my childcare like much of America. And so my 3-year-old was home all the time. And this was a kind of work that felt urgent, felt important, that I could do, and also that I could do with my son around, because I was just sewing the same thing over and over again. I could be interrupted and I could come back and know exactly where I was. It wasn't like working on a book, or writing a huge project where you need a certain kind of concentration, a certain kind of space. And so this was a labor that I could engage in, and it felt, it was a really great way to build community and to have some togetherness in a time of isolation.
I wonder if any of you would like to talk about the word auntie and how it's distinct from the word aunt or aunt, and kind of how it changed the dynamics in some way for that, or the way that the word auntie and its alternatives, auntie, uncle, etc., were bandied about. What did the word auntie signify, and kind of what did it do for the group? Oh, you're all too modest. You all got to jump into the fray. Should I pick?
Sure, I can start.
Like being a teacher.
I can start, and I know Chrissy and Preeti will have plenty to say too about this. But having grown up in a Vietnamese refugee family and among Asian Americans and other communities of color that have place a lot of importance on extended family, and not just blood family, but the families that you live in community with. I think having a sense of responsibility to others who aren't necessarily within your nuclear family. And Rebecca, in your essay, you write really beautifully about that. Just the ways that the nuclear family is so limiting. So I think the auntie term is a way to signal a certain set of women's work, traditionally women's work, but also work that is uncompensated, underappreciated much of the time, and yet absolutely key to just keeping our society running, especially in a society that has very little infrastructure for domestic labor, for childcare, for all of these things that families need in order to keep participating in the economy, to keep living their lives and having security. That aunties sort of fill that gap. And so there is an extent to which auntie is related, is sort of associated with communities of color, because these figures have really important cultural functions. But of course, it's cross-cultural too, and it was something that we were able to relate to. So as a group of mostly women and mostly women of color, it was a way to kind of speak back to histories of labor exploitation and to make visible the ways that we were doing labor that filled a lot of gaps in our society.
Chrissy, Preeti, do you want to add anything to that?
I'll add to it, just building on what Maelyn spoke of. I think personally, when I joined the Auntie Sewing Squad, it was really my first time identifying as an auntie. So in my own personal history, my mother passed away from cancer when I was 13 years old. So I have 3 aunties on my mom's side, my mom's sisters, that stepped in and became the primary models of womanhood, motherhood, auntyhood, to take care of me. They made sure that my belly had food, that I had, money for gas, and that I had a home, a place to sleep in. And so for me, like personally, like aunties are that caregiver role when the nuclear family falls apart. And so I think the Auntie Sewing Squad, they were able to combine this auntie role of a caring figure with elements and core values of social justice. And so for me, that called a different lineage, where as a historian, I'm also studying revolutionary aunties. So aunties like Yuri Kochiyama, who invited political prisoners to stay at her home. Aunties like, or, radical activists like Grace Lee Boggs, who created community gardens in Detroit. And then also activists like Grandma Kim in Los Angeles, who was a bus riders union, transit rights activist. So I love that the Auntie Sewing Squad combined this caregiving figure with elements of social justice, and we were able to apply that to our mask making.
Can jump in a little bit too. So for me, I grew up with aunties in the way that folks are describing, not necessarily about a blood relationship, but anyone who's in a community, in the community that I grew up in, who's providing some semblance of maybe care, but honestly, it's kind of like a universal sort of fictive kinship sort of term, where anyone in the community is an auntie, and then this extends to like the person at the grocery store, the restaurant, et cetera. But auntie is a kind of vexed term in terms of gender relationships in South Asian spaces as well, because aunties are, kind of older figures who are sometimes associated with gossip mongering or policing, or particularly around performances of gender and sexuality. Aunties are also very, badass, if that makes sense, in the sense of, great fashion sense, or, just really occupy a kind of role that is kind of can be kitschy, if that makes also sense. But I think for the Auntie Sewing Squad, what was really powerful about the deployment of Auntie is, one, we applied it to anyone of all genders. We also applied it to anyone of all ages. So we had aunties who were 8 years old and aunties who were in their 80s, right? So it's a, for us, yes. So it was really about that kind of project of care, thinking about various kinship, queer chosen family roles. And that's kind of what you also highlight in your essay too, Rebecca. So
I'm trying to give people just a sense. It's kind of funny because we have an audience of aunties who know all this stuff better than me, but we also have an audience of people who might not know anything about the Auntie Sewing Squad and who absolutely need to get this book from City Lights, not from any big box monstrosity. And City Lights will do online mail order to any place in the world, incidentally. But I wanted to just bring up the fact that the Auntie Sewing Squad was founded by Kristina Wong. It was largely led by and to a significant degree populated by Asian American women. And I wanted to talk about sewing, masking, and race politics racial justice issues, et cetera. Just ask all of you to talk about that, and also about how masks became politicized by the right, and kind of the Auntie Sewing Squad was making masks, in March 2020, when we were just figuring out what the hell a pandemic was and what constituted safety in it. But the official retirement happened last month, in the month. Well, no, wait, we're in November, and August and September. So we kept it up through all the mask wars. Okay, that was 11 questions, but do as thou wilt.
Sure, I can start. I think the racial politics were really important in this group, and this has been and continues to be a pandemic that has exacerbated all the pre-existing social inequities that we have lived with forever. And part of that has manifested in a disproportionate impact on communities of color, where communities of color have been vulnerable to COVID-19 and to the economic effects of the pandemic and to just all of the different effects. And so this is, it's been really important to the Auntie Sewing Squad that we try to make visible those inequities and to address them by doing our work directly for the most vulnerable communities. The racial politics were also playing out in a context in which there was rising violence against Asian people in the United States because of the scapegoating that was happening from the top in our politics. And so as the pandemic went on, it was clear that Asian and Asian American people and women especially, and elderly people especially, the most vulnerable people, were being targeted in the streets, were being harassed and in some cases beaten, doused with acid. These were stories that many of us really took to heart because we were watching the news and we were trying to do this work to address racial inequities through our mutual aid work, while also fearing what could befall ourselves and our family members during the entire time. So I think it's really important that we what I mentioned before, that there were mask making groups that kind of situated themselves in a patriotic Rosie the Riveter tradition. And I think that has value, but I think it's also really important to view this also as in some ways, a more radical group than that, like that every aspect of what we did was political. Every aspect of the pandemic was political, how it played out, the needs that appeared and the needs that we were trying in our limited way to meet. And we eventually did make and send out about 400,000 masks, and we're continuing to do all kinds of mutual aid work, even in retirement. And all of this is for communities that have been suffering because of structural inequality.
Other aunties want to take these 11 questions up?
I'm thinking a little bit to, in my own work, I look at, race, gender, labor, the relations of capitalism. And one thing that's so powerful about this, this mutual aid group, the Auntie Sewing Squad, is its understanding of the kind of histories of garment work, and in particular, the racialized and gendered histories of garment and sewing work. And so, for the Auntie Sewing Squad, it was really important to kind of name some of those histories, understand the kind of exploitation that garment work squarely sits in, and to also kind of confront, if that's the right word, a lot of our own histories as maybe second, third generation folks whose own grandmothers and mothers were in fact workers in the garment industry by way of migration, race, labor, war, empire. And so I think, what really struck me as we were putting together the book and sort of the conversations with folks, and also just the array of, again, there's so many amazing pieces in here, but the array of pieces, the array of photographs in here, even a caption will sort of reveal someone's kind of, intergenerational relationship with garment work, in the sense that aunties pulled out sewing machines that were in their garage that they inherited from their own mothers or grandmothers, and had kind of a insistent reaction on not sewing because of that. And it took the sort of pandemic and folks' own histories with mutual aid work. And we have a range of folks in the Auntie Sewing Squad, again, who have been longtime activists and organizers, who are in the nonprofit sphere, who are teachers, professors, a lot of folks in the performance arts spaces as well. But I say that to say that, when it came to kind of sewing, not everyone was, kind of like myself, a sewist. Not everyone had, sewn before. And so part of the Auntie Sewing Squad's own racial justice politics is kind of recognizing this women of color feminist and Asian American feminist analytic that's rooted in these relationships to work and garment work.
Did you add any more response to that, or shall I move on to the next question, which is very connected?
Go ahead, Rebecca. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. And one thing I think that a lot of people wouldn't know is, where did those 400,000 masks go? What was the process of deciding where they went? How were the communities connected to? And then that might segue smoothly into talking about the Black Lives Matter solidarity and the work with the Navajo Nation, the Standing Rock Lakota, and some of the other kind of spin-off projects that happened. So take that prompt and run with it, you three.
So I can start us off. We had all mentioned earlier that the Auntie Sewing Squad was different and unique from other sewing collectives because our politics were overt, and we prioritized sending masks to underserved communities, BIPOC communities, Black, Indigenous, people of color communities. And this is because we wanted to recognize and express solidarity with these communities that have long been underserved and have been ignored and have been disenfranchised by structural histories and structural racism. So we sent masks. I'll name a few, but I might miss some. So please chime in. So to Native American communities whose reservations have long been ignored and under-resourced, to asylum-seeking communities at the US-Mexico border, farm workers, those that had been impacted by racist policing and unequal incarceration policies, low-income communities of color, transgender teenage youth organizing, and then also protesters protesting against the wall, protesting for Black Lives Matters movement, and then many other organizations. So I also want to give a shout out to the super aunties. Each of the super aunties, so for those of you who don't know what super aunties do, super aunties are the main coordinators, and they're in charge of coordinating with certain populations that we're going to send those masks to. So we have a super auntie for coordinating with Native American communities, Constance Parn, super auntie for coordinating with farm workers, Laura Carlin, and other super aunties. I'm sorry, I'm not recognizing those or making those links right now. So as soon as we decided and prioritized BIPOC communities, we our super aunties kind of organized and coordinated with those communities. I will also say that what makes the Auntie Sewing Squad unique is that I loved that the super aunties did their research. They did their homework, and they worked with those communities to figure out gaps in policies. They worked with them to figure out and listen what they needed. And it was establishing those important and intimate connections that really made me as a sewing auntie feel secure that my masks and my labor were going to those communities. So this is in contrast to other sewing groups that I was a part of, where sometimes they would just post an address and say, this group needs a mask. However, they hadn't done the research, and the address was freely posted, and there was no kind of background check on that. So it was unclear that there had been an established connection with those communities. But with the Auntie Sewing Squad, there was that established connection, that research. And the last thing that I'll say is that that connection was important because on the Auntie Sewing Squad had to sift through which communities we had to prioritize, because we got a lot of mass requests. So for the communities and the organizations that we didn't work with, they actually had a vetting process. And so they would ask members of the Auntie Sewing Squad if they had a history with this organization who requested the mass, and if they could vet the requester. And by vetting, the Auntie Sewing Squad or super aunties would ask them about their work in the community and their policies and their histories. And if they had in fact participated in racist policies or they had unaddressed racism, the Auntie Sewing Squad would actually turn down those requests. So there was a vetting process for organizations that we didn't have a history of working with.
Does anybody want to talk about Auntie Constance and Badly Licked Bear and some of the alliances that grew? And one of the things that people might not know is, yeah, the Auntie Sewing Squad sewed and made masks, but so much more happened. Actually, Auntie Amy Toft just finished our second annual coat drive to send coats to some of the Lakota communities by the hundreds, winter coats for kids. And that's and a lot of relationships, I think, formed just by reaching out with masks, and then, a lot more happened. But anybody want to jump in? I know those were very leading questions. I kind of wish we could pull up. I know Badly Licked Bear is out there somewhere. Yeah.
I was going to say that might be another question for Chrissy.
I'm sorry, Rebecca, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, I just wonder if you could talk a little bit. I remember one of the beautiful gestures of solidarity was to just send masks to some of the NAACPs and communities really impacted by George Floyd's police murder and what happened afterwards. And then also, I loved how organically relationships grew. I think one of the remarkable things about the Aunties is it created a lot of friendships. It created a lot of relationships that it was kind of sewing together the social fabric that had been so torn up in some ways, to like badly use a bad sewing metaphor. And, but two of the things that really impressed me so much was Badly Licked Bear taking up driving a lot of materials, much needed medical, sanitation, and sewing supplies to the Navajo Nation over and over and over. I think they did their last load just a month or two ago, and it began in the summer of 2020. And then the wonderful Auntie Constance, who became a really cherished friend of mine, connected to Standing Rock because she'd been connected to the Dakota pipeline resistance and became an integral part of the Lakota Wellbeing Project, which is a healthcare project led by John, whose last name I'm temporarily forgetting, although I've hung out with him. And, ultimately, like more than 6,000 pounds of medical supplies went there, and ambulances were purchased, and all kinds of things happened, starting with Auntie Sewing Squad. And I might have partly answered my own question, but those relationships were so extraordinary, and I don't want them to be left out for anybody who thinks like, oh, you sewed masks. And it's like, yeah, you start sewing things together, and one thing leads to another, and one thing connects to another. And I thought that was amazing. And maybe it also leads us to think about what mutual aid meant to each of you, whether being in the Auntie Sewing Squad changed it, and how the Auntie Sewing Squad kind of modeled mutual aid, and maybe for me transformed my understanding of mutual aid. But, the other thing I could say is you're all free to bring up things about the book, things about the Auntie Sewing Squad, or anything you want. And, taking over the, redirecting is highly welcome.
Yeah, so I totally want to give a shout out to Badly Licked Bear, who has an amazing contribution to our book entitled Behind the Wheel of a Large Automobile Full of PPE. And just picking up on what Preeti had mentioned, of there's actually many different kinds of auntie roles. It wasn't just sewing. So Preeti is a cutting auntie, but Badly Licked Bear was the driving auntie or the driving auntie. And they organized I think at least 4 van trips from California to Navajo Nation. And I agree, Rebecca, it was so great to see the ways in which the Auntie Sewing Squad expanded mutual aid, not just by sending masks, but actually listening to the communities and seeing what else they needed. So it was really great that the Super Aunties and Kristina Wong asked what Navajo Nation needed in order to sustainably survive and protect themselves against this pandemic. So they didn't just need masks, right? But our mutual aid evolved. We wanted to also provide them with sewing machines because they also wanted to learn and make masks themselves. And so that, so we listened to them and provided that. And they also needed other supplies like cleaning supplies, tents so that they can socially distance from each other, toiletries because the reservations were under-resourced. And so Badly Licked Bear provided the Fortress of Gratitude, where they all collected all of these items and plopped them in the front of their house. Just graciously, Badly Licked Bear decided to drive all that stuff from California to the Navajo Nation and made multiple trips. So that was one of the ways in which our sewing squad actually expanded from mass to mutual aid drives. And just to pick up on that, Constance Parng, she also took a lot of driving journeys as well herself. So she also started driving mutual aid vans out to Native American communities. And now she's working on a project I think it's thinking about building better hospitals and building better resources around water.
So go ahead.
Yeah, thank you to both of you, Chrissy and Rebecca, for bringing up just the multitude of auntie roles that existed. I also wanted to shout out to our care aunties, Gail, Isa, and her team, because I think this is another thing that was really distinctive about the Auntie Sewing Squad, is that we were always conscious of the well-being of the aunties themselves, and always conscious of the imperfect system in which we were working, where we were doing this uncompensated and really at many times like very difficult, physically demanding and difficult labor, and giving of our time, taking away from our paid work, our family time, our caregiving responsibilities, and so forth. And so the care auntie system was that aunties could request, food, they could request treats. Aunties were making crafts for each other. I mean, it was everything from donuts to tote bags to pins and like buttons with political slogans, which in the book we label as like affirmations of shared values. Like these were all things that reaffirmed the community that we were in, and that everybody's labor, everybody's contribution mattered. And we tried to take a more disability justice approach to the work that we were doing, that everybody's contribution mattered. And it wasn't really about productivity in the sense of like, well, who can make the most masks or anything like that. But it was just like what you're able to give, you give. And I think that's also connected to the idea of mutual aid as being about solidarity and not charity. So when we talk about giving things to communities, that's not a like a one-way relationship or a top-down relationship. So I think it's important to know that this has to do with sharing political concerns. And in many cases, we're working with communities that we have a personal connection with, either because we belong to that community or have worked with them closely in the past. And so this isn't about just giving to people in need, but really about situating ourselves as part of a whole world that needs to take care of each other better. And so all of these different roles come together to help us do that. So I think that's really important to just sort of keep in mind that mutual aid work very much comes from a position of vulnerability, a position of oppression in many ways. And it's not about just people who have giving to people who have not, because in many cases, aunties were unemployed, aunties were struggling, aunties were caring for relatives, aunties got COVID, aunties were sick themselves. And we felt the importance, like the need for solidarity in a time where everybody was struggling.
I want to prime people to start asking questions because we're going to go to Q&A soon. And what I feel like I learned from the aunties, because mutual aid is always described in our very transactional culture as though there's a mutual exchange, like it's one of those monstrous Christmas Secret Santa nightmares or something like that. And I realized with the aunties that what mutual aid actually means is because of love, because of solidarity, we are already connected. So we give to you not to build a relationship, but because the relationship is already there, the value, the connection, the inseparability, the solidarity is already there. But what was also really striking for me is not only the anti-care, which was the sense that the aunties also deserve to be taken care of, that there's many ways in which this isn't one way, but also the way that a lot of aunties received, a lot of participants, I should say, not everybody identified as an auntie, found meaning, connection, kind of refuge from the loneliness of the, and the isolation and the fear of the pandemic, a sense of agency, and et cetera. And I've looked at a lot of mutual aid projects, and I've never seen anything like this in terms of the intelligence, the solidarity, the kind of radical understandings applied to every gesture, every process, every relationship. It was really stunningly beautiful.
I can sort of
mutual aid
speak to that, Rebecca. Yeah, thank you so much. Part of what you're describing is, I would say, the implicit argument of the book, and a thread that's in a lot of our chapters, but an expressed argument in my chapter as well. I'm thinking a lot about mutual aid and radical care as two terms that have really come to the surface in the pandemic, and for good reason. Such powerful kind of formations of local autonomous projects that many folks and formations have kind of pulled together to provide need, to meet a kind of emergency sense of relief in this crisis. And this is like a crisis amongst many crises, right? But I think, mutual aid, to kind of take a step back, certainly existed before the pandemic. Folks have written about it, like Dean Spade, yourself, in terms of the Black Panther Party, in terms of Hurricane Katrina, rapid response, right? A way to kind of name a response that's rooted in long-term work for change against systemic harm. So mutual aid work has that sort of level of meeting an immediate need, but also recognizing sort of the systemic oppression in which the current situation or crisis is happening. And there's also a sense that, these crises are ongoing. But I think, to kind of jump into what you're saying, the Auntie Sewing Squad, first of all, I think Kristina Wong says that she didn't even know about the term mutual aid, and it was afterwards that folks are sort of describing the project in that sense, that she really kind of understood that. But I was sort of thinking about, like, what makes the Auntie Sewing Squad different, and it is this kind of piece of radical care, and it is the sense of not just, you know, solidarity, not charity, but you know, the Auntie Sewing Squad imagined its own obsolescence, right? It never wanted to be a nonprofit. So it's staying away from this charity model. It's staying away from kind of like morally attaching, you know, a sense of who's deserving and undeserving in terms of giving. But it's also very much bound up with notions of liberation or justice. And I think I said this before, but I was also looking for a place where I can kind of make sense of what's happening. And this idea that, you know, we're not just giving masks to folks who can buy them, folks who can access them once masks became widely available. And also just like the distinction, really, frankly, between PPE and cloth masks. Like this is a failure on the part of the government, right? And that's core to the Auntie Sewing Squad. It's a failure on the part of the government. And, you know, it's also, like you said earlier, the politicization of masks in general. Like, we should just be wearing masks. I don't know. So the fact that this mutual aid project existed in this kind of immediate sense is grounded in these reflections, grounded in this understanding. But to, you know, I think I'll just sort of end with kind of what Maelyn was saying, that for aunties, it's also about the mutuality in mutual aid. It's that bi-directional notion that we're also participants in this pandemic. We're also sort of isolated. We're experiencing this, our own version of mental health and distress. And so I never jumped on a, you know, Stitch and Zoom, but I spent hours on Facebook. I don't know why, but I'm like reading everyone's comments in the beginning, and, you know, different parts of 2020, the year that didn't happen, you know, we're just posting gifts to each other and just sort of sharing, you know, interactions. And I was lucky enough to be by a hub, the West Side hub, and would stop by Leilani and Ova's to drop off pre-cuts and get salve. And I'd take it home and I'd be so excited. And I'd be like, what is in this? How did they make, you know, who made this? So it's just that kind of, like you said, it's the physical gifts, but it's the kind of affective relations that were really important. So that answer was everywhere, but I hope it helps.
The mutual aid was everywhere. So it's a beautiful
Yes.
way to cover, to begin to cover that incredible complexity.
Yeah.
Valerie So posted a wonderful list of some of the things that were exchanged: cookies, stuffed fish pillows. I got one from M. Chen, which I love. Necklaces, little bags, pound cake, congee, cupcakes, yoga lessons, online Reiki, marmalade, and so much more care from each other. I got lemons over and over from Valerie, which was very exciting. I don't know if we should go to Q&A now. I'm not seeing obvious, you know, we've got so many comments in the questions. Let me see. I'm not sure I can sort out.
I think there's one question in here from D.
Yeah, more questions, people. But I also was going to ask the three of you, so this completely amazing thing happened that was so many layered and multidimensional and complex, and how did you make a book out of it? What was the decision process of how to represent this? And, you know, I also had questions about your own beautiful essays, but, you know, time is fleeting.
Yeah, thank you, Rebecca. And thank you, Dee, in the chat, the question about how did the idea for the book develop? You know, I think at some point in the spring of 2020, the three of us and a couple of others were organizing a conference panel. So it just happens that Preeti, Chrissy, and I are scholars of Asian American studies, and we decided to organize a conference panel as a way for us to kind of process and intellectually frame the work that the Auntie Sewing Squad was doing, because we could see like a really extraordinary project and community building at that time. And then that sort of coincided with conversations that I think, Rebecca, you were having with your editor at the University of California Press. And when we all kind of got in the room together to talk about a vision for a potential book, I think it was clear that you know, many of us felt really strongly that this should be essentially a manifesto, that this was a chance for us to think about the work that we were doing within a critical race and feminist framework, specifically coming out of the intellectual work of women of color feminists and Black feminists. And so I think for us as feminist scholars of critical race and ethnic studies, that was it was a really meaningful and special project to bring together the mutual aid work that we were doing. And for myself, the craft that I've been involved in since I was a child, but that I hadn't been able to explicitly connect to my scholarship, that the book, it was important to us that the book have that intellectual framing, but also that the book be very accessible to many audiences, because the Auntie Sewing Squad was a really diverse group of people from all walks of life. And they had so many stories to tell, so much to share. And so we wanted a book that, while it's framed around 5 essays by the 3 of us, Rebecca, Grace Yu, who's another Asian American Studies scholar, and then work by Valerie So and Kristina Wong. We also have space in the book that is creative work by aunties from all over the squad. So artwork, poetry, recipes, photography, and more. This is a book that we wanted to have reflect like the texture and the culture and the dark humor and the fear and anxiety and just all of the things that were part of being in the Auntie Sewing Squad. So those were some of the considerations that came into play. We were thrilled that UC Press was so supportive of the vision of specifically what we called from the start, we wanted a beautiful manifesto. There were so many artists in the group, so many people with ideas and working on creative projects, and this was a chance to bring some of that together.
I want to do a little shout out to Leah Chandra, who I'm pretty sure designed the books, UC Press's head of design, herself an Asian American woman and a visual divinity, and somebody I've had great joy in working with, and who I presume was the person who pulled all this together into the kind of beautifully laid out, formatted design book that it is. But other stories about making it into a book.
I think I can add on to Maelyn. I think I politically grew up and nerded out around texts like This Bridge Called My Back, Making Waves, the writing by the Kambahi River Collective. So these are all very anthology style, creative writing kind of style and or manifesto style pieces. And, this is a manifesto type organization. We have core values. We have, a lot of, again, conversations and comments where we're not shying away from the kind of political milieu, but also our own approaches to this work. And again, because folks are kind of coming from different backgrounds, being visual artists and performers, playwrights, scholars, or folks with photographs that they want to share that were integral. Everyone was a beautiful photographer in the Auntie Sewing Squad, and we spent, again, like I've been saying, a lot of time on Facebook. And one sort of aside and inside joke is that we were sort of wondering what the retirement party would be if we're all a bunch of introvert nerds online and we don't really know each other's real names and see our kind of Facebook profile pictures. Like, what would it be to come together and actually try to talk to each other? And I will say that I was very awkward at the retirement party, but so I think for this project, it's just stunning the kind of, I think we put a call out to the group. Chrissy wrote the call, and we had so many folks sort of offer their perspectives and their stories and their photos. I'm really moved by this one image on page 160 by Sanaya Robinson Guerin, How to Measure Selfie. And my Zoom blur background is not going to do justice. Yes, absolutely. And I don't know, this is one of those images that's, she in her caption sort of tells her story, if I may read. My 2020 began with a month spent painting a watercolor a day in Listowel, Ireland. As an artist in residence, I returned to the US in mid-March, just in time for our stay-at-home orders. I thought I'd be spending the time in my studio continuing to paint and make art, but because of our government's lack of preparedness, I instead searched for a way to be of service, I dusted off my industrial machine and started sewing masks to donate to healthcare workers. This practice turned into a new project, a mask a day. And so, you know, part of this project is bringing in everyone's kind of whole self, bringing in Auntie Sanaya's watercolor background. And I mean, we're not around each other. And so being able to see her contribution like this and have it be in this book is very powerful. And I think that was part of our method.
Oh my, I just went to gallery view and I can see all these aunties crafting, knitting and sewing away and like still being just ridiculously productive. And it's kind of beautiful and wild. And so two of you just talked about the book. Would the third also like to talk about how you turn a revolution into a collected volume?
I just want to build upon what Maelyn and Preeti talked about. We had really imagined the book as auntie driven. We really wanted to center the voices, the artistry, the perspectives, and the histories of the aunties themselves. Just picking up that we did a call, and we really made that call for creative writing and artists really broad, and wanted to see what the aunties would bring to the table and wanted to see what they would talk about. And then we organized it based on these 5 themes of labor, solidarity, survival, mutual aid, and posterity. And it was so great to get that mix of these large research inquiry essays with creative writing, with personal histories, with photos and with recipes, and keep that balance of critique, but also as both Peter and you, Rebecca, were mentioning, how it's darkly humorous, and it's inspirational at the same time, very gut punching, and so we really wanted it to be inspiring, but also to really drive home what Maelyn was talking about, like a critical race and feminist manifesto.
Let me see, where shall we go from here? We're at 10 minutes after the hour. Maybe because we have so many aunties in the audience, I have a lot of fantastic comments about the youngest aunties being 8 and other important things, but I don't see a lot of other questions. If people have them, you're getting your last chance. Peter, did you secretly collect any questions, and do you want to pop up with them? Valerie, so if you'd like to talk, Peter could unmute you, because you certainly have had a few things to say in the comments. Let's see, Badly Licked Bear has important things to add, like I still have a case of Trader Vic's Mai Tai. A lot of interesting surplus got distributed to Southern California aunties. I had wanted to read a passage I copied down from Grace Yu's beautiful essay. I not only did it turn into, all kinds of material going to some Native nations and relationships, but Grace Yu taught San Francisco State University class on mask making, got donated sewing machines, and it became this completely amazing thing early in the pandemic. And she wrote, "What I wanted to teach during those times was care. My pedagogy of care was rooted in what I think of as auntyhood, a set of values and practices that go beyond care for immediate family and extend to those all around us." Okay, comments.
Auntie Valerie has been.
Hi.
Yeah, hi, there she is.
I'm a chat monster. I'm sorry.
Auntie Val. Oh my God. And you're surrounded. You're a million aunties strong. Look at all
Yes,
those
indeed. That's from one of the short films I made about the Auntie Sewing Squad called Radical Care. And we made that with collaboration with all the aunties, and they sent me clips because at that time, back in June last year, we weren't able to go shoot anything. So everybody just took their phones out from their camp and took pictures and sent it all to me, and we edited it all together. Laura Carlin, who's one of our care aunties, helped us choreograph this piece that you're seeing a little bit of behind me. And but I think what was really wonderful about this project about the aunties is that it was really very much a response to the miserable job that the federal government was doing. And we have a phrase that we use called rage sewing, that we just were so angry at sometimes for all of the criminal neglect. I would say even worse than that. Malicious and criminal response that the Trump administration had to the COVID-19 crisis here in the US. And that's a really important part of the Aunties too, is that it really is a form of activism and pushing back and trying to correct, or at least address that those inequities that were happening. So I don't think that those inequities have gone away, but at least we have a different administration now, which is maybe slightly better than the past administration. That's my little rant.
Valerie, do you want to say anything about the documentary film project you're working on now? I mean, you have the two short films.
Yes.
And then more in store.
Yeah, it's going to be very much like, there's a article that we're saying. It's going to be about the aunties and use the same format in that we will try to crowdsource as much footage as we can to get, kind of like the book was done, just get contributions from the aunties, because it's so important to have the multiplicity of voices of the aunties, because it's a very non-hierarchical structure that we have, even though we have this so-called overlord, Kristina, right? She wasn't like ruling us from the top down. It was really bottom-up organization. And so that's important to reflect too. So that's in process now. So I will be further working on that for the next 5 years. And then we'll see what happens.
One thing I would mention, because we didn't yet, is that a lot of people did incredibly beautiful sewing. And there would be these pictures in the working group, Facebook group, almost every day at the height of it, where people would spread them out in a fan or a wreath or some other shape, and you'd see all these exquisite calicos and colors. And I would always hope that all the people who were wearing them would kind of like hang out together, so you could see, those mustard yellows and those spring greens and that amazing orange together. There was another amazing moment when Southeast Asian Southeast Asian Buddhist community in Richmond, California. I forget were they Cambodian or Laotian?
Laotian, yeah.
Laotian, yeah. Gave a huge amount of orange fabric that would normally be monks' robes. And it felt very magical to have this fabric. For me, it felt very protective, and a lot of masks got made out of that orange for a while. But on top of everything else, it was just such an, really beautiful stuff was going out. I've seen a lot of would-be mutual aid, not naming any names, of like, soup kitchens with kind of substandard sanitation and things like that. And, and I've seen amazing mutual aid, but the craft in this, some of it pictured in the book, was stunning. And I'm a textile fan. And so just seeing all those beautiful fabrics, people would somebody would donate their whole quilting collection. We had some master quilters like Auntie Melissa and stuff. And that was part of what was happening too, is like this intense productivity. And no questions, closing words. Come on, go down sewing or go down theorizing. My closing words would be, this book is completely amazing. Everyone needs it. It's beautiful, it's action-packed, and it's available from City Lights no matter where you are on Earth, as is almost every book in print, actually. You never, ever have to buy from Amazon, because independent bookstores love mailing you books.
Thank you, Rebecca. That was beautiful. Actually, I would like to give, before I make my final statement, I want to give the final word to our authors.
I was going to jump in there and say something that we were actually talking about right before this started, is not to be a downer, but to kind of honor the complexity of this pandemic and the multiple timelines and temporalities that we're sort of in. And it's highly remarkable that this book came out in the height of the pandemic, but it's also something that I'm thinking a lot about, if I'm being honest about, you know, the fact that we're still in it, that the global dimensions of this pandemic are quite rough, the vaccine inequities. You know, we don't know what's to come. There's still a level of uncertainty and high stress and anxiety. And so I'm trying to hold both, right? Like the celebration of this book, the celebration of this mutual aid project, of all of you in this space. And then this beast of the pandemic and these ongoing sort of crises that were exacerbated in the pandemic. And so, you know, for me, the book is it's a real testament to this incredible work, and where part of me wants to just say something that's not helpful, like we're really lucky to have it. But it's work that we all did. It's work that we all did, and it's I'm stunned that it's here. So I just want to say thank you all in some ways.
There were so many people that made this book possible. And I think that reflects just the work of the Auntie Sewing Squad and the ways that we had to and were able to support each other throughout the pandemic. So I want to shout out to Uncle Van Nguyen, who is one of the members of the Auntie Sewing Squad, with whom I worked on the chapter that I wrote about sewing as refuge. He's a fellow Vietnamese refugee and someone who is a strong advocate for formerly incarcerated people, especially in the Asian Pacific American community. And he himself spent most of his life behind bars and was released on parole about a year before the pandemic began, and now has a lot of fights ahead of him to really rebuild a life, and you know, is doing all of this advocacy and mutual aid work because it's important. And I think you know, he really holds a position of honor in the group and is an important part of our story. And there are so many folks like that in the group who just have these really amazing, you know, sometimes heartbreaking, sometimes inspiring stories. And so this is a book that reflects all of that. I also want to say, you know, Preeti, thank you for naming just the complexity of like celebrating this book at a time when people are still suffering and still really struggling. And many of us are still grieving too, because there were a lot of losses that we suffered during the pandemic and are continuing to. There are also things to celebrate, such as community and this project. And the fact that early this morning, I woke up and made an appointment to get my 5-year-old son vaccinated. And he's in the book too, the 3-year-old who's wandering around my house while I sew, now 5. So it's, you know, a lot of emotions.
Chrissy, do you want to have the last word?
I just want to tack on to what both Preeti and Maelyn have said. I think this book launch has been bittersweet. We are so happy to celebrate the intellectual labor and the creativity of our work and the labor of the aunties. But at the same time, we want to recognize that there are people who aren't here to celebrate it, and there are people that are still struggling and dealing with the inequalities and the effects of COVID-19. So I think with all of that, I hope that we hope this book continues to be read widely. We hope that folks are inspired by the Auntie Sewing Squad. I, for one, am always curious about what the Auntie Sewing Squad is doing in their retirement. And probably my students will follow up this semester and ask them this question for the oral history archive. But I think for me, the takeaway, this is my first time participating in a mutual aid project, but this won't be my last. So thank you so much for providing a model and giving me this experience. and for educating me.
Auntie Val wants to take a group photo, so maybe we should stay here for a moment. But thank you everyone for coming. Buy lots of books, especially this one. And thank you so much, Peter and City Lights. And Peter, if you want to unmute everyone, we could.
Sure. Let me make a couple of little statements. Well, first of all, I mean, the amount of love in this room tonight, I mean, it was deeply, deeply moving. Everybody buy a book. It's gorgeous, and it is filled with love. So thank you all. Also, big shout out to Catrice Lassell and UC Press for all of her efforts in making tonight happen, and for all of you in the audience helping complete the circle.
Do people want to wave while I take a picture? Okay, hold on. Ready? I'm going to count. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Okay, I'm going to count down the other way. 3, 2, 1. Okay, everybody say ass. Ass.
We didn't even talk about the acronym.
The acronym is there in plain sight for everyone to see. Bye, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Yay.
everyone.
Bye, aunties.
Bye.
Hey,
Thank you so
Ellen.
much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Buy more books.
Beautiful.
Yeah, that was Alana.
Great, amazing job.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you, book aunties. It was fantastic. Congratulations. See you
Thank you,
soon.
Valerie.
Thank you, Val.
Thank you. Thank you, City Lights. Thank you so much for hosting us.